Hey, what's up, you guys? My name is Jason, and today I'm going to talk to you about primitive types and reference types in JavaScript. So let's get into it. So first, I'm just going to show you some diagrams that I have to explain how it works, and then from there I'll just show you the code and give you some examples. And so, what are primitive types? So we have these primitive types right here. So we either have a Boolean, which evaluates to either true or false. We have a number, string, null, or undefined. So these are all considered primitive types. And so with primitive types, we have with primitive types, the way it works is, let's say we have a variable called color1, and we set that equal to a string called red. And we have another variable called color2, and we set that to equal to another variable, which is the one we defined above this one, which is color1. So both of these essentially have primitive types as their values. And so the key thing to note is here with primitive types, when you assign a primitive type to a variable, and let's say, like in this case, we set a variable equal to another variable here, that primitive value is stored directly inside that variable. So each variable gets its own copy of the data. And so if you look here, we have a variable and a value. So color1 is red, color2 is also red. And so let's say we want to change the value of color2 to blue. Then that means we're gonna now have color2 equal to blue and color1 equal to red. So like I said before, with primitive types, if you assign it to a variable, that value will be stored directly inside that variable, and it'll get its own copy of the data. So even though we had color2 equal to color1, and then we made a change, color1 is still going to equal red, because each variable will get its own value. And so with reference types, let's go into that now. So the difference here with reference types, objects would be considered reference types or reference values, mainly because, let's say we have a variable here. We have a variable called object1 equal to this object, and we set object2 equal to object1. And so what's the difference here? And so, like in our previous example up here, we had sort of the same thing. We had two variables and they're equal to the same thing. But like I said before, each variable will get its own will get their own, their own data. But in this case, with reference types, when we assign an object to a variable, that object isn't actually directly stored inside that variable. The variable is actually referred to as a pointer to that object. And so like I did here, we have object2 is equal to object1. So basically these two variables are going to point to the same object. So if you look here, we have two variables and their values are pointing to an object that's in memory, which was created right here. So when we made this object, this object is now created in memory, and so now object1 is pointing to this object, and object2 is also pointing to the same object because we set that equal to object1. So these variables don't actually store a copy of that object. They actually just point to the same object in memory. So that's the difference between reference types and the primitive types. And so if we actually make a change in our code, and so let's clear this out. Okay. All right. And so I'll just run this real quick, and basically, whoops, let me console.log this out. Okay, so yeah, so basically, like I said before, we have two two variables, and that's equal to this object, and then object 2 is equal to object 1. And so when I log those out, they're basically pointing to the same object. And so let's say now I want to consolidate this out. And so let's say now I want to make a change to my variable. So I'm going to take object 2, my object 2 variable, and I'm going to modify the object. So I'm going to add a last property, which is going to have the value Rivera. And so if I console.log now these two objects, what I'm going to see is object 2 not defined. Whoops, console.log this out. Okay, and so now if you see, I made a change to my object 2 variable. I added a property on it, which is Rivera. And so if you look here, I actually didn't make a change on my object 1. I just made the change on object 2, but because these are reference types, wherever I make a change, if I make a change on, since I made a change on object 2, and because object 1 is actually pointing to the same object in memory, because the variables are essentially pointers, it's going to reflect the same changes as well, because they're pointing to the same object. So that's why we have the same value here, the same object essentially. So yeah, so that's basically it for primitive types and reference types. Hopefully you guys were able to understand the differences here, and if you guys enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, and if you want to see more content like this, subscribe. And yep, so have a good day everyone. Bye.